Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today I'm going to be going over this data and processing this image of the Heart Nebula. This is one that I captured for an hourly rental customer. So he has given us permission to do a video using his data. This was obviously captured in SHO, or narrowband, with a monochrome camera. So we're going to go through a couple of different processing options, and we'll start with talking about how we captured the data, and then how we processed it in PixInsight, and how we ended up in Photoshop. So I want to start by talking a little bit about how I captured the data. It was captured at our remote observatory, Utah Desert Remote Observatories, which is a remote observatory at about 5,500 feet elevation in the Utah desert. This was on a Takahashi FSQ 106 with a ZWO ASI 6200 mm Pro camera, so that's a full frame monochrome camera. And then it has a filter wheel with LRGB, sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen filters. So to start with, what I use to capture the data is Voyager, and the system is already configured. So this is Voyager that you see in the window here. If I go to the setup section, this is where the camera, the mount, the guiding, all of the various devices that are connected are defined and configured. And then if I go to Tools and Editors, one of the tools I have available is a sequence editor. And within the sequence editor, I can open the sequence, the heart for Scott. Scott's the client here. And I have loaded the target details from the framing tool that is part of Voyager. So you basically select the target, select the framing, just all done visually, and then capture the RA and declination and rotation angle. The system does have a rotator on it. And then you just fill in the rows with what filters you want. So for instance, I'm capturing data with the hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur filters at 600 seconds each. And those are going to be repeated multiple times. And then I'm also capturing some red, green, and blue, and I'm going to use that primarily for the stars. So this will give us natural color RGB stars, but we'll have the individual narrowband hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur, which gives us a lot more contrast and detail in the nebula. I executed this from a script that ran overnight, and as it runs, it just automatically downloads the images to my home computer, so they're available to begin processing in PixInsight. So let's just jump over to PixInsight, and I've got a couple things still open here, so I'll close these. And typically, the first thing I would do is go through with the blink tool and just review all of the images to make sure that they all came out good and they're worth processing. And I would do that by going to Image, Image Inspection, and Blink. Process, Image Inspection, Blink. And then there's a set of icons at the bottom of the Blink window, the first one being to add image files. And so I click on that, and then I just simply navigate to the folder where I have that data stored, and that would be right here. And I just select one, press Control or Command A on a Mac, click Open, and it will open all these in a form that I can quickly blink through, or step through one after another very quickly, and review the quality of the image. And if there's any bad ones, then I'll use this Move tool to move any of the bad subs out of the folder, so that when we're done reviewing them, this folder has only good data in it. And then that makes it easier as you move forward, that we know we've got a folder with nothing but clean data. And typically first thing I'll do is use the little apply automatic histogram transformation tool. By default, it calculates an auto stretch or a preview stretch for the first image it loads, and then it just applies that same amount of stretch to all of the images. In reality, each image probably would be viewed best with its own calculated auto stretch, and that's what this button is doing. It's just going through and calculating a distinct auto stretch for each image. And now I can click on the top one, and then I can use the cursor key and just step through and review the data. So these were narrowband or broadband, blue and green. Here's the hydrogen. You can see how much more detail you get with the narrowband filters. So we've stepped through these and we know they're all good. So with that, I would close these files and then close this tool and move on to the next step. Now the next step is a process called WBPP, which stands for Weighted Batch Preprocessor. And what it does is it takes all of these raw files from the camera and converts them into a master file that we can then process using PixInsight. It's still in a PixInsight uses a proprietary form of the FITS file format, so it's still a format that's somewhat unique to PixInsight. It's not something you could open with Photoshop or any other photo editor yet, but that's our goal, is to get these files into something that we can then work with a normal photo editor. So to get to WBPP, I'll go to Scripts, Batch Processing, Weighted Batch Processing. And typically the first thing I'll want to do when I open this is reset the tool so I have a fresh starting point. So I'll just click on the Reset button, and I will reset it using the settings from the last session. And I want to clear all file lists, and then I'll also not purge the cache. And click OK. Now across the top are tabs where we can load the various types of files. Lights are the most important. That's the data, the images that you've captured, or sometimes called light frames. And then we have 3 different types of calibration frames that are usually used. Flats, dark, and bias frames. So let's load the light frames first, and to load those I can click on plus lights down here at the bottom and then just navigate to that same folder where our data is captured, and I'll just select all of those. And you'll notice that in the naming we've got the filter name, exposure lengths, and so forth. And PixInsight is going to use that information along with data in the FITS header to know what kind of data it is. It wants to group all of the like filters together. So for instance, here's all of our hydrogen, here's all of our oxygen, here's all of the sulfur, here's all of the blue, the green, and the red. Now to load the calibration frames, I could load each one of these one at a time with the plus buttons down here. What I do is save a folder of all of my kind of pre-processed calibration master files. So I can just go to plus directory and go to the directory where I store my calibration masters. And this is the Takahashi with a mono camera. So I just select folder, and it will go through, find the calibration frames, and recognize what kind of calibration frame they are. So it puts the master flats in the flats tab, the darks with the darks, and the bias with the bias. We're about ready to start WBPP processing this data. The last step would be to go to the calibration tab and see if there's any settings that we need to change here. If this were a color camera, we would need to tell WBPP that these are color filter array or one-shot color images. These are not, so we don't check that. We also need to tell it where we want to store the resulting files. And typically what I would do is go to my D drive, where I keep a folder of swap files, and I'll set up a folder just for this target. So in this case it's labeled Heart for Scott. Click Select Folder. And so at this point, it's ready to run. And all I have to do is click Run. It will do a quick check to make sure there are no errors, and also make sure there's enough space on the hard drive. And then when I'm ready to go, I just click Continue, and it will go off and process the data. Now, I've already processed the data, so I'm going to cancel here. And let's look at the results that come out of WBPP. So I'll just close this WBPP folder. And let's take a look at what we've got. I just double-clicked here in the background, and that brings up the Open File dialog box. And let's go back to our D drive, to our swap files, and our Heart. And you'll see now we've got a master, a registered, a calibrated, and log. And what we want is the master folder. And within the master folder, we'll see that there are master lights. And I had selected auto crop, so there are both normal and auto crop versions. And you'll see that again now there's now one master file for each filter, so it's combined all of those individual exposures into one master file where everything is stacked and averaged and ready for continued processing. So I'll just select the six files that I want: blue, green, red, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and I'm selecting the auto crop version and click Open. And so now PixInsight is going to open those 6 files, and because they're auto crop, it's also going to load a crop mask image, which I don't need those. I wish there were a way to not generate them, but it does generate them as an integral part of the image. So I'm just going to quickly go through and close these auto crop mask images, and now we're left with just the 6 main images. And you'll notice that they look completely black. And that's because these are still in a linear stretch or linear state. They haven't been stretched yet. And what stretching does, there's a lot of fancy ways to explain it, but basically what you're doing is making it brighter. It's called stretching because as you make it brighter, it looks like you're stretching the data in the histogram. What you're really doing, you're not really stretching the histogram, you're brightening the image, which causes the histogram to get more spread out. But we can apply a screen preview. Doesn't change the file, just changes how it's displayed. And we can do that with the screen transfer function. Now you'll notice over here on the right hand side I have some icons, and these are all icons that I have saved from the menu. There's, for instance, if I look at all processes, you can see there's lots of different processes here. These are the ones that I normally use. So what I've done is just save an instance of each one of these over here on the right. So the auto stretch is called a screen transfer function. And if you're new to PixInsight, you'll quickly learn that the naming is not intended to be intuitive. Screen transfer function is an auto stretch for screen preview purposes only. And if I double click on this, it'll open the control tool. And I could have also got to the same place by going to Process, All Processes, and find the screen transfer function over here and load it, open the tool that way. The radioactive button just applies an auto stretch so that you can see what the data looks like. Here's our sulfur data. If I click on the radioactive button, it's calculating, and there it is, brightened or stretched so that we can see what we're working with. And we could do the same thing with the oxygen. There's the oxygen data, and here's the hydrogen data. Hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur are the 3 main images that we're going to work with in a narrowband image. We also have individual red, green, and blue, and I want to combine these into a red, green, blue full color image. And I'm not even going to bother to look at them individually. What I'm going to do is open up the channel combination tool, and here I can define what image do I want to use for red, what do I want to use for green, what do I want to use for blue, and it will combine those three monochrome images into one RGB color image. In fact, let's just take a quick look at this is the blue. If I apply the screen transfer function, this is taken through a blue filter, so it represents just the blue light that's in the image, but the image itself is black and white. So let's start with red, and the image that we want to put in the red is obviously going to be our red data. And then we'll do the same thing with green. We'll choose green to go in the green slot, and blue will go in the blue slot. And now that I have these three defined, I can just click on the circle here, the solid circle, to apply this or execute this command. Sometimes it's the circle, sometimes it's the square. But we now have a full color image, and if I apply the auto stretch to that, you'll see that we now have a full color RGB image. The color's not very good. It's got kind of a yellow-green color cast to it, but it's a color image now. And at this point, we don't really need the individual red, green, and blue, so I'm just going to go ahead and close those. And now we have 4 images to work with, and I'm going to go to Window, Tile Windows, and that just spreads out all 3 images, or all 4 images, so we can see all 4 at once. Now the first thing I want to do is a little bit of processing on these. Typically the first thing I will do with each one of these images is correct for any possible gradient that might be in the images. And to do that, I'm going to use this gradient correction tool. And again, I have a saved process or saved instance of that. And so I can just grab my gradient correction tool and drop it onto the image where I want to process it. And PixInsight will start processing that image with the gradient correction tool. And once it finishes, then I'll just drag it on to the next one and so forth. So I will do that, and I'll restart the video when I'm done with those 4. Okay, so the gradient correction has been run on all 4 images, and they don't look a lot different, and that's because there was really no moonlight or light pollution to deal with, so the images are pretty good to start with. The next thing I want to do is a couple of steps that are unique to the color image. The first thing I want to do, because we're mostly after the stars in this image, I want to make sure that the stars are in really good shape. And if I zoom in, they look nice and round, but I want to run a tool called Blur Exterminator. This is an add-on tool, so it's an addition to buying PixInsight. And I'm going to run it in correct only mode, which means it's only going to correct the stars. It's not going to try to do any blur extermination or deconvolution sharpening of the background information. And so as this runs, it's going through and using an artificial intelligence algorithm to estimate the deconvolution parameters, and then it can mathematically use those parameters to reduce the natural blurring that's in the image. So it's not actually sharpening. Sharpening is something different. It's not generative AI. It's not using AI to create stars. It's using artificial intelligence to estimate parameters that you would normally have to do iteratively, kind of by hand, to estimate the blurring parameters. And so that has finished, and there's just a little bit of tightening up of the stars, so that's good. The next thing I want to do is color balance this. And PixInsight includes a tool called spectrophotometric color calibration. And I've got that, again, I've got that saved instance over here. And I'm just going to drag the saved instance onto the image and let it run. Now what it's doing, it's looking at the stars that are in the image, and it's comparing those to the catalog known colors of those stars for the star type and temperature. And then it works iteratively to find an overall white balance for the image that will do the best job possible of matching all of the stars to their correct colors. So if it matches perfectly, then each star's actual color will match its catalog correct color. And when it's done, it will produce a graph for us that shows us how well it was able to match the colors. And if it falls along a straight line, so it produces this output. And basically, the closer to being on a straight line, the better job it was able to do matching the stars to their actual colors. And you'll notice the image has changed, so let's update our screen transfer function auto stretch. And now we get a pretty good view of what it looks like in correct color. So the stars have been color balanced, and the rest of the image just goes along for the ride with that correct color balance. And as we would expect, it comes out mostly red because hydrogen is the most abundant element, and hydrogen gives off red light. So the next step now, I want to run for each one of these images, and now I want to run a full blur exterminator that not only looks at the stars but also looks at the nebula behind the stars and does another pass of deconvolution across the whole image. So I will run that on each one of the images just by clicking my saved icon, drop it on the image. And when I have this done on all 4 images, I'll come back. Okay, that processing is done. The next step now, these are still linear files. In other words, we have not actually stretched the image. We're only stretching it for screen presentation so we can see. It's kind of like turning up the brightness on your monitor. That doesn't really change the image. Now we're to the point that we actually want to change the image and permanently stretch the data. To do that, I'm going to use the screen transfer function tool because it does a very nice job of calculating at least a good starting point for stretching the data. But I can't apply it from the screen transfer function to the image itself. In order to apply it, I have to actually open another tool, and that's the histogram transformation tool. What I can do is I can use the screen transfer function, and right now it's focused on this color image. And if I want to fine-tune the image a little bit, I can move these sliders a little bit to really fine-tune the appearance of the image. And I don't want the dark areas to go completely black because we'll lose data, and I don't want any of the bright areas to get too bright. And I'm especially worried about the stars because there are still a lot of stars in this image, and they obscure the beautiful nebula. So I'm going to stop about there, but what I need to do now to apply this is use this triangle, which will copy these settings to somewhere else. And what I want to do is use this triangle, click, and drag down to the bottom bar of the histogram transformation tool. And now if I click the square to apply this transformation, it'll actually stretch the image. Now we're still applying that screen transfer function, so the image has been stretched and then we're stretching that stretched view. So we need to turn off that stretch, and the easiest way to do that is with F12. I can also use this icon in the screen transfer function toolbar. And now we have an image that's been stretched, and we know we're not looking at it through the screen transfer function because it no longer has this green bar like these others do. See, there's no green bar here next to the title tab. But now we want to do this same step to each one of the other images. So I'll update the auto stretch, and then I may tweak it a little bit. Usually the tweaking involves enhancing the contrast. Not always, but usually. And once I'm happy with it, and it doesn't have to be perfect, I will just apply it the same way and then move on to the next image. And I usually just leave it white as a kind of a a little process flow reminder that I've already worked on that image. This is the oxygen, and you'll notice that the oxygen is mostly dominant within what I would say is, kind of the center area of the nebula. We just want to be careful our background isn't too dark, and then we'll apply this and move on to the last one. I just click on the image that I want to process, update the radioactive button, tweak the brightness with the screen transfer function tool, drag the triangle over, click the square to apply it, and we've now stretched all 4 of our images. And I'll just quickly move through and press F12 on each one to turn off the screen stretch. Now we have stretch data. So at this point we have photographs. We have stretched the data, we've turned it from raw data into a picture. We still have black and white pictures of the hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. So we want to apply color to those to create a color image. We have a color image in the RGB data, and if we want, we could save this image as a TIFF file and just have a saved TIFF image ready for any other additional processing. You could save it as a JPEG even if you don't want the file size of a TIFF. And to do that, I would just go to File, Save As, and notice the blue bar shows that this is the selected image. And let's save this on the D drive in the same folder with the raw data. And I'm going to call this RGB Final with stars. And generally I want to save my TIFF files as 16-bit TIFFs, anticipating that I may want to do some additional processing in a photo editor, and having a 16-bit depth gives me more flexibility. Now, something else I could do, a very common color palette is HOO. And HOO is using hydrogen as red and oxygen is green and blue. And the reason that's a popular color palette is because it's pretty close to a natural color. In reality, hydrogen really is red. That's the color it's emitting when it glows. And oxygen really is emitting cyan, which is a combination of green and blue. So if we want to create an HOO image out of these, I can go back to my channel combination, and for hydrogen, for red, I can choose hydrogen. And then for green, I can choose the oxygen. And then I'll also choose oxygen for blue. So I'm putting oxygen in both the green and blue channels. So now we have hydrogen, oxygen, oxygen. And when I click the circle, it will create a HOO image for us. And because it's already stretched, it's basically ready to go. Now you may notice the stars are somewhat cyan looking. That's not unusual. If we look at the initial images, we can see that the stars in the hydrogen image appear much smaller than they do in the oxygen image. So we may want to use a tool to correct for that green. And there is a tool under Utilities, I believe, to correct, it says correct magenta stars. And they may have moved it. Oh, here it is, correct magenta stars. And we don't really have magenta stars, we have green stars. But if we invert this image, and I don't normally do this, so I'm kind of feeling my way through here. If I go to I wonder if Control-I would work. Yep. So Control-I, I inverted the image. Now the green stars are magenta. So now I can go to Script, Utilities, Correct Magenta Stars, and execute this. And it's really only going to affect the stars themselves. And now we'll convert back to just Control-I again. And now we have corrected that cyan color cast around the stars. It's not completely gone, but it's much better than it was. And just like we did before, we can go to File, Save As, and we'll save this as a final with stars. So now we've generated two finished images. Now we can do the same thing, and again I'll say this is a 16-bit TIFF. We can do the same thing with SHO, sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen, but I think what we'll find is it's going to be very green. Let's go ahead and combine those just to see what it looks like. So for red, we're going to choose sulfur, because sulfur is the most red of the three. Hydrogen is less red, so we're going to color map hydrogen as green. And then oxygen is the least red, so we'll map it as blue. So now we have sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen as red, green, and blue. And again, we have a lot of green in this image, and we have, if you look at the stars, there's quite a magenta color cast. We could use the same tool, go to Script, Utilities, Correct Magenta Stars, and because they're already magenta, we don't need to invert the image. And it will help reduce that magenta color cast so we have a little bit more natural looking stars. The image is still pretty green, but again, we can save this as a finished image, or at least a semi-finished image. And this will be SHO final with stars. And again, I'll save this as a 16-bit TIFF. And because these are just saved as TIFF files, you could now open them in Photoshop or any photo editor, or I'll say almost any photo editor. Some may choke on the 16-bit file size, and begin processing them, you know, change contrast, change color, make them brighter, darker, whatever. I like to take it a step further and process the stars separately from the individual red, green, and blue, or sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the way I do that is I will use I'll use two tools now to finish processing. I'm going to use Noise Exterminator, which these are pretty clean images, but there's still a little bit of noise. Noise Exterminator just cleans up any residual noise without affecting the detail. And then the last one is Star Exterminator. And what Star Exterminator does is it actually separates the stars from the background, so that I wind up with two images, an image of the background without stars and an image of the stars without the background. So let's just run those on the color image as an example. So I'm going to start with Noise Exterminator, and I'm just using the default settings. And again, I have a saved icon representing that process that I can just drag over and drop on the image where I want to run it. And that just takes 20 or 30 seconds to run. So now that Noise Exterminator is done, I'm going to run what would be the last process in PixInsight for this image, and that's Star Exterminator. And I want to be sure in my settings that I have selected Generate the Star Image and use the unscreen process to generate the stars. And then I'll just drag that onto the image, and this takes about 30 seconds for it to run through. Okay, now that Star Exterminator is done, you can see now we have a new image. This is just the stars without the background. And then here is just the background without the stars. And as I said, the real power of this is in a photo editing tool like Photoshop, where you can create different layers and have one layer of just the background and one layer of just the stars. You can process them separately and really get much better results. So we're starting to transition into a little bit more advanced processing. But what I'm going to do now is just like we did before, I'm going to save this as a 16-bit image. And this is going to be the RGB starless. And just like all the others, this is going to be a 16-bit TIFF file. And then I'll save the stars, again, as a 16-bit TIFF. So this is RGB stars. Now, the last thing I want to do is go through and process each one of the narrowband images. So just like I did with the RGB, I want to run Noise Exterminator to clean up any noise, and then I want to run Star Exterminator to remove the stars. And I think I'm going to end up using these stars, the hydrogen stars, because they are the kind of the finest and most detailed and will be the least obtrusive in the image. So I'll wind up saving those two. But the main thing I'm going to do is run Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator on each one of these narrowband images, and then save the starless image as a 16-bit TIFF. And I will do that and be back with you when I'm done. Okay, so I have removed the stars from the hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen, and saved each one of these starless images, as well as I mentioned earlier, I was going to save the hydrogen stars. Now, it's going to start getting a little bit more advanced and complicated, so depending on your familiarity with tools like Photoshop, this may get pretty confusing pretty quickly. The fundamental thing we're going to do, though, is stack these different images in layers so that we're using kind of the best parts of each layer. And we're also going to apply color to the hydrogen, oxygen, and the sulfur to create a full color finished image. So I'm going to do all of that in Photoshop. So let's hop over to Photoshop and let's look at the image I've already processed first, just to see. These are layer groups, and within each layer group there's a set of, if we look at the hydrogen, there's a set of kind of standard adjustment layers as well as the layer itself. And the little eyeball over here on the left tells me that that layer is currently turned on, or the visibility is turned on. So for instance, if I click on the eyeball next to the stars layer group, you can see I can turn the stars on and off. And if I look at the hydrogen layer group, and I'm going to turn off these global adjustments are just kind of overall general adjustments that if you loaded one of those finished TIFF files, you might use global adjustments to adjust things like brightness and contrast. I'll turn these off for a moment. And you can see a lot of what it was doing was adding color saturation and shifting it a little bit more to the red. If I look at just this base layer, let's turn off the global adjustments and let's turn all these others off. So now we have just the starless hydrogen layer turned on. And there's a couple of things that I've done, and I'll do these kind of repetitively to each one of the layers. The first thing I do is an auto levels, and that just kind of finds the darkest points and the lightest points, and you'll notice it adds quite a bit more contrast to the image. I usually have just a blank image or layer that I could use for local brightening and darkening. And then I have a final brightness and contrast adjustment. And then this last one is a hue saturation adjustment layer. And this is where we establish what color we want this layer to be. And in this case, it's hydrogen. And in an SHO color palette, it would be green. So we use this hue saturation adjustment layer to colorize this layer green. And just like we've colorized it green, the oxygen has been colorized blue, and the sulfur is colorized red. And when we look at all three of those together, we get that SHO color palette. And you notice this doesn't have that real dominant green color because I've done some other fine-tuning to bring out more of the red and less of the green. Let's kind of start from scratch and build this image from the ground up, keeping in mind that our eventual goal is to have layer groups where each layer group contains one layer along with adjustments, and the adjustments are applied uniquely within that layer group. And we'll have some overall global adjustments that we can apply, and then the stars will be available to apply independently. So let's start from scratch, and to do that I'm going to go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And what this does is it lets me select a whole bunch of individual images and load those individual images as individual layers. So I can browse to go find the images that I want to load, and they're going to be on the D drive where we left them. This is where we saved everything from PixInsight. And I'm just going to go ahead and load all of these. So there's, 9 or 10 layers here. And if I wanted to go find more files, I could browse and add additional files to the list. I don't need to, so I'm just going to click OK. Photoshop's now going to create a new document, and it's going to load each one of those images as its own layer. And because all the work we did in PixInsight was working with astronomical data, PixInsight, for instance, registered all of the images. So these are all in register with one another, so everything lines up. The layers are all the same size, so everything comes into Photoshop very well organized and properly sized. Here's our sulfur layer, our oxygen, our hydrogen. This is the stars. And again, we can use the eyeball to turn individual layers on and off. There's our RGB stars. Here's our RGB starless image. Here's our final SHO with stars that we created. Here's our final HOO that we created. Now, you could load this, for instance, as just open it up as an image, do some editing to improve color and contrast, save it, and you're done. I mean, you don't have to do the additional work that I'm going to do here. But I think you'll see the additional work really has a lot of payoff to it. And then here's our RGB final. So you might think of this as kind of the default image that you would get with red, green, and blue with the stars. If you're using something like a DSLR on a camera or one of the smart telescopes like a C-star, you might get an image like this. So I said we want to put every layer into its own group, and I'm going to start with the stars. And just like we can turn the star or any one of these layers on and off with the eyeball, we can click and drag and move them up and down this layer stack. So I'm going to move the stars all the way to the top, and I'm going to put the stars into a layer group. And the easiest way is to select the layer you want to put into a group, and then press Control-G, that would be Command-G on a Mac. I'll change the layer group name from Group 1 to Stars. And if you remember, we clicked the option box to use the unscreen method in Star Exterminator. So now the method we need to use to put the stars back in is called screen. And that's a blending mode. And the default blending mode for a layer group is pass-through. And if we open up that drop-down, There's screen. So now we have this in screen blending mode. And for instance, if I come down here and turn on the RGB starless, and I'm going to, just so it's not confusing, I'm going to turn off this final down here. So we're only looking at two layers now, the RGB starless and the stars themselves. I can turn the stars off and on and see just the background. I can turn the background off and on and see just the stars. And just for good measure, let's go ahead and put the starless layer into a layer group. And I'm going to label it RGB starless. Now, if I come down inside the layer group, so I've clicked on the layer rather than the layer group, let's add an adjustment layer. And the most common adjustment layer I'll use is levels. And levels is used for adjusting brightness and contrast. This is the histogram of the image, and you can see the histogram doesn't go all the way over to the right edge, so there's nothing brighter than kind of a bright mid-tone. If I move this tone stop for whites to the left, I'm going to be brightening the whites. And if you look at the image, you'll see that the background nebula is getting brighter, but the stars are not getting brighter. I can brighten the image, I can darken the background, and together that gives me more contrast. And I generally use a black background because I don't want the background of the image to become black or the same as dark as the surrounding canvas. So this is probably about the darkest I would want the background areas of the nebula, but I can make the bright areas brighter. We can still turn the stars off and on. And if I want to make the stars less dominant, I can come to the stars layer group, add a levels adjustment layer, and if I make the stars darker, that in effect makes them smaller. So now we have less dominant stars, more dominant nebula, and if we compare that, I can just use this little chevron to collapse these layer groups. If I turn the final with stars, let's bring it up all the way to the top and turn it on. That was before we did our star and starless separation and adjustments, and that's after. So you can see just that little bit creates quite a difference. So let's turn off the stars, and I'll turn off the RGB, and let's work with the narrowband. Let's start with the sulfur happens to be on top. I'll turn it on, and I want to put it into a layer group. That's Control G, and we'll change the layer group name to sulfur. And now we need to add some adjustment layers. Let's add a levels adjustment layer and just click the auto button to automatically find the bright and dark areas. And that added a lot of contrast, almost too much. So I may reduce the opacity of this to something like that. Now I'll just add a blank layer. I'll put it in soft light blending mode. And this is here just in case we need it for local lightening and darkening. If you don't have to add that. I'll add another levels adjustment layer for fine tuning. Excuse me, I sneezed. And the last thing we want to do is add color. And we're going to add color using this hue saturation adjustment layer. Now I'm selecting them from the adjustments palette just because it's a quick, easy way to organize your workspace. You can also come down to this yin-yang symbol at the bottom and choose whichever sort of adjustment layer you'd like to add, such as hue saturation. You can also go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Hue Saturation, and click OK, and it will always add it on top of the currently selected layer. Now we want our sulfur to be red, so I'm going to click on the colorize option, and I want to make the lightness -50. I want the saturation to be 100%, and then the hue, since we want red, by default it starts at red, which is a rotation angle of 0. So now we have our sulfur colorized as red. I'm going to turn it off. We'll go to our oxygen, which is the next layer down. And notice I don't have any other layers visible. Again, I'm going to put this into a group. Change the group name to oxygen. Click on the layer itself within the layer group, and you can see it's indented within the layer group. I'll add a levels adjustment layer. Click auto to auto find the endpoints. And again, that appears a little too aggressive, so I'm going to back off the opacity on that auto adjustment, and then we'll add a blank layer in soft light blending mode, and then I'm going to add another levels adjustment layer for final tuning, and then I'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer in colorized blending mode, -50, 100% saturation, and this time, because this is oxygen, we want blue. So I'll just drag the color slider over to blue, which is a hue rotation angle of 240. Now I'll turn that off. We'll go to our hydrogen, Control G, change the name, click on the layer, add a levels, click auto, and again it may be a little too aggressive, so I will reduce the opacity of that adjustment layer. I will add my blank layer in case I need it in soft light blending mode, another levels, and then a hue saturation in colorized blending mode, or colorize option, -50, 100% saturation, and this time we want green, which is a hue rotation angle of 120. Now if I turn the oxygen and sulfur back on, we don't quite have a color image. We can only see one of them at a time, and that goes to the blending mode. Each one of these layer groups is in pass-through blending mode, and what I want to do is put each one in screen blending mode, just like we used for the stars. So, and lastly, go to the sulfur, put it in screen blending mode. Now we have an SHO image where the red is coming from sulfur, blue is coming from oxygen, green is coming from hydrogen. In most places where there is hydrogen, there's also sulfur, so that's why we're getting a lot of orange and yellow. There is some more pure hydrogen over here on the left, and that's why it's green. So we might want to do a couple things. If we want to start tinkering with the color, we can certainly add a set of global adjustments, and that would typically for me be a levels adjustment, which I add above the sulfur and below the stars. Then I would add a global soft light layer for local brightening and darkening. Then I would typically add a color balance and a hue saturation. And then I would just select all of these and Control G to put those into a layer group and change the group name to global adjustments. So if I want to make global adjustments, one simple way, for instance, to make the whole image brighter, would be to adjust this levels adjustment layer at the global level. If I want to change the color balance, for instance, if I want to pump more red into this, I can just use the color balance and make it more red. If I want less green, I can add some cyan, I can play with the blue. In other words, I can do a lot of adjustments just with these global adjustment layers. And there's nothing wrong with that. And then turn the stars on, and I now have a more finished SHO. For comparison, let's bring our SHO final up to the top so we can turn it on and off. This was the SHO that we got out of PixInsight by doing the processing, the basic processing there. This is our SHO that we've processed so far in Photoshop, just with global adjustments. Now, typically I would do a lot of these adjustments by working with the individual hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. There's two ways you could work with them. Let's reset our global adjustments. So if I go to this adjustment layer, and of course these adjustment layers are non-destructive. They're only changing how the image looks. They're not changing the pixels themselves. So if I reset this, we're just back to where we started. And I'll do the same thing with the levels. So if I want more red, we know red is coming from sulfur. And we're already applying the color at 100%, but we can make this layer brighter. And if we make the red brighter, that's putting more red into the image. So if I go to my levels adjustment, and if I move this midpoint slider, that adds more red, but I don't want to make the background too red, and so I can slide my dark slider to the right so that we don't make the darks or the black areas more red. We only make the medium and the bright areas more red. And that gives us a little bit more color contrast in the image. And we have a little bit more control because now we're able to avoid putting a lot of red into these dark areas. And then I might do the same thing with oxygen and hydrogen. I might want to bring a little bit more blue into the image and a little less into the dark areas if they start getting too blue. And then lastly, I might do the same thing with hydrogen, that we can experiment to see if more hydrogen or less hydrogen looks better. You almost get it's pretty good just where it is. Maybe take some of the hydrogen out of the dark areas. And this gives us a pretty pure SHO image. I might come back to my sulfur and boost it a little bit more. It's, you know, you're somewhere in the intersection of art and science here. So it's kind of what you want it to look like. Now, a lot of the dark areas sometimes just devolve into dark noise. And a trick I use for that is to go to my global adjustments, and at the very top of the global adjustments layer group, I'll add a solid color fill layer. And I want it to have RGB values of 19, 19, 19. So I can type those in here so that I get 19, 19, 19. So it's a very dark gray, not quite black. And I only want this to affect areas that are darker than this. So in other words, I want anything that's darker than this layer, I want to lighten to that brightness. So I'm going to change my blending mode from normal to lighten. And generally you might want to see a little bit of effect from this. If you look at some of these dark areas around the perimeter, you can see what it's really doing is just neutralizing those and bringing those up to a predefined dark level. So everything is looking pretty good at this point. The stars, to me, are still too dominant. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with the starless image. I could go to my levels adjustment in my global adjustments and adjust the background just based on what I want it to look like. I might continue to fine-tune the color a little bit, maybe something like that. And that gives us a really nice SHO image where we can now see the blue is oxygen, the red is sulfur, the yellow and green is hydrogen, so we can tell what this nebula is made of as well as what its structure is. If I want to turn the stars back on, to me the stars obscure some of the data. And remember I said I was going to save the hydrogen stars? And I have those saved down here. The layer's currently turned off. So let's just drag this up into the stars layer group. And I'll turn on the hydrogen stars. Now we don't see them because they're below the RGB stars. But if I turn off the RGB stars, that's the hydrogen stars. And you can see how much finer they look. The stars are still there, and we might even want to brighten them a little bit. So the stars are there, but we're really featuring the nebula rather than the stars. Now, the RGB stars, though, captured a lot of nice color. So if we take just the color from the RGB stars, we can do that by putting the RGB stars in color blending mode. And let's boost this saturation a little bit with the hue saturation adjustment layer. And now we have kind of the best of both worlds. We have the small stars that were captured through the hydrogen filter combined with the color of the natural RGB stars. And if you remember, we used that spectrophotometric color calibration tool to fine-tune the color of the stars so that they were the correct color. And we may want to, iteratively come back, adjust the brightness overall, maybe play with the black point a little bit. And at this point, the image is pretty well done. Now, you could save this image as a native Photoshop file, and that'll retain all the layers, all the adjustment layers, everything intact, so that we could come back tomorrow or next week or next year and make further edits on the image. And to do that, I would just go to File, Save As, and I will save this in my 2025 Photos folder, which is under my Documents, Photos, 2025 Photos. Now, because this is such a large document, I need to save it using the large document photo format, and I will just name this as Heart Nebula for Scott. Now, Scott might want just a finished image without having to have Photoshop to even look at it. So to do that, I can go to File, Save a Copy, and I will tell Photoshop to not save the layers. And let's save it as a TIFF format. So this version now is not going to have the adjustment layers. It's going to be just a kind of a flattened version, but it will have all of the detail that we see here. So that's something that if he wanted to open it in just a basic photo editor, he could. Let's take this one step further, and then I think I'll be at a good point to stop. If you recall, I kept adding these blank layers in soft light blending mode. What that soft light blending mode does is it lets me paint on an image with either a black brush or a white brush to emulate what you would do in a darkroom called burning and dodging, where burning would be making an area darker, dodging would be making an area lighter. And we do it by painting with a brush at a very low opacity, usually like 5 or 10%. And if I paint on this soft light layer with a black brush, it'll make it darker. If I paint with a white brush, it'll make wherever I paint lighter. So I'm going to start with a really big brush and switch to white by just tapping the X key. And every time I tap X, it just switches the foreground color between black and white. If I paint over here with white, that added a little brightness there. If I paint with black, it adds a little darkness there. If I paint with white and just kind of, Control Z to undo, paint with white, and go around this bright perimeter, we can make that stand out a little bit more. And it stands out even more if I switch to black and then darken inside the perimeter. So contrast is dark next to light. So by brightening the outside and darkening the inside, we can create more contrast. And this is just a very interpretive, artistic exercise. And if I turn this layer off and on, that was before, that's after. If you look at it and you think, well, I like the effect, but I think it's too strong, then you can just lower the opacity and dial that in. So that's an overview of kind of start to finish capturing, processing in PixInsight, processing in Photoshop, saving it as a large document format PSB, as in boy, file from Photoshop, and also saving it as a flattened TIFF file that could be used for further processing in any photo editor without needing Photoshop. If you have any questions, be sure to drop those in the comments down below. I apologize that this was such a long video. As somebody said, if I'd had more time, I would have made a shorter video. But remember, I had to sit through the whole thing too. So I hope with that, you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.